You're listening to Make Planning Make Sense. I'm Aaron, and I'm a director at Centro.
And I'm Alex, a planner at Centro.
Today we're talking with Professor James White of the University of Glasgow.
Yeah, James has written a book called Condoland, where he studies the case of an inner urban brownfield site in Toronto.
And before you adjust your dials thinking, oh, it's a Canada episode, the conversation is just about 100% applicable to the UK context.
That's right. And Aaron, he wasn't just any professor, he was your professor.
He was. Technologically speaking, this is actually quite an interesting episode because it's the first one that we've recorded over Teams. So bear with us on the sound. It sounds like you are on Teams. By the way, Concord Pacific, if you happen to be listening and you happen to know the profit margin for the Cityplace development as a percentage of GDV, please do let us know.
If you're a fan of the podcast, remember to share it with your friends and follow us on social media. You may know us from LinkedIn, but we're also on Instagram, X, Blue Sky, and YouTube. Our handle is MPMS Podcast on all platforms.
Share it with your friends. Share it with your frenemies. We don't really mind. If you think somebody's going to be like, oh gosh, that is so my experience, then please do. If you think somebody's going to be like, I had no idea things worked that way, please do. Really keen to keep this conversation going the way that we have. Thank you again. Here is our conversation with Professor James White. Professor James White, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's actually a really lovely kind of full circle to have you on the podcast because you were one of my professors at the University of Glasgow back when I was doing my planning master's.
That's right. Nearly 10 years, I think it was.
I know. I have to say, it is because of you that I do have a copy of The Concise Townscape by Gordon Cullen on my bookshelf. So thank you for that.
Fantastic.
But we're here to talk about your book with John Punter, Condoland, the planning, design, and development of Toronto's Cityplace, and the implications that it has for the UK. And there are a lot of parallels there. But if you wanted to start us off with the impetus behind the book.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. Really interesting to meet and speak to you and to see you again after a long time in practice. The impetus for Condoland really stemmed from trying to understand a bit more about the densification of city centres. There's a city in Canada that's very well known for this, Vancouver, on the west coast of Canada, where many decades ago now, back to the late 1980s and early 1990s, they started to densify the city core. US and Canadian downtowns were very much dominated by commercial office property, and therefore they would sort of disappear into the night after everyone went home at 5 o'clock. The city of Vancouver was keen to reintroduce city living into the city core and was a bit of a pioneer at that. This wasn't happening at quite the same speed in other places. And it was very successful. House prices and affordability not being one of those. The creation of a more livable environment on the downtown peninsula was very successful. And it was something that other cities looked to. And so there's this idea of a policy transfer, or urban policy mobility, some people call it, where ideas of urban form and urban planning travel from place to place. And one of the places that these ideas traveled to was Toronto, which is Canada's biggest city on Lake Ontario. What was interesting was that the developer that had built much of Vancouver's waterfront, a company called Concord Pacific, ultimately purchased a piece of land close to the waterfront in Toronto and promised Toronto city planners that it would recreate Vancouverism on the Toronto waterfront. So that was the impetus for the book. How do ideas go from one place to the other, and what role do planners play in shaping that journey?
Okay, yeah. I mean, there definitely was a lot of talk about Vancouver for the past, 15-ish years, I'd say. From the photographs in the book, I've not been to Cityplace in Toronto myself, but it looks fine. It looks very 21st century. And it looks like there has been a fair attention to detail. It's not exactly characteristic of any one thing in particular, sort of in reference to that concept of the way that design and urbanism theories are more global.
On your point about the sort of globalization of design, I think that's what we see in the transfer of the idea from Vancouver to Toronto. So the kind of nub of the idea was this thin tower of about 30 or 40 stories, with then a 2 to 3 story podium that would either contain townhouses or perhaps on more busy streets, some mixed-use retail units. And you're right, some of the critiques of that are that it's a good sort of coded design, but it's placelessness because it's sort of an architectural formula that planners are comfortable with, developers know how to produce. So the amount of innovation around it sort of disappears, but the sort of nuts and bolts of it are pretty good. That's what Toronto's planners wanted to see at Cityplace. And initially what happened was that the planners in Toronto almost gave the developer more freedom, perhaps, than Vancouver's planners had. I think they assumed that the developer would behave in a similar way, despite the change in planning system. And what was really interesting was that the developer quickly realized that there was a more laissez-faire planning system in Toronto, that developers were given greater latitude, and therefore that they could ultimately make more money because they could build taller towers and also slightly fatter and wider towers that then didn't integrate very well with the two-story podium. So they looked a bit sort of haphazard in terms of their sort of architectural form. And the planners ended up being a bit sort of disappointed. And what you then see over the course of the development is that typology that's come from Vancouver evolves somewhat and becomes more like the urban form of Toronto. So the podiums actually get bigger. They're more like 8 to 10 stories. And actually that means that they work better with a taller tower. But lots of the sort of aesthetics of the buildings remain the same. So like the window finishes, the window wall, the rising of balconies and stuff all look still a bit like Vancouverism, but on a sort of bigger, stockier scale than was seen on the waterfront.
Yeah, some of the photos, particularly one where there was intended to be a gateway into Cityplace, and it's these two towers, and it looks like the Petronas Towers, but kind of pulled apart. There was another mention about the way that a sky bridge was meant to frame views of the park from within which the sky bridge is viewed. And I think, I don't know if the exact word was dubious, but I think that you were like, yeah, it's a bit bullshit.
Yeah, and those two issues are good examples of sort of what was missing in the planning and design of Cityplace that was very present in Vancouver, which was attention to detail. This was thought of at an extremely fine grain. And in fact, you mentioned at the start of the conversation, The Townscape, which is a book by Gordon Cullen written in the 1960s, actually more about European and urban form in the UK. But it was all about the sort of visual experience of the person walking through the urban environment and how the relationship between different buildings creates a sort of sense of visual drama. In Vancouver, to some extent, the planners and designers and developers achieved some of that. They created public spaces that were quite contained in their size and had the right proportions around them to make you feel comfortable in the space. And they did things with view corridors and the positioning of buildings that allowed you to see out to the water and around to the mountains that surround the city. When you get to the Toronto case, everything just kind of gets blown up a little bit. And so those towers and forms and massings don't have the same visual drama at street level. You're kind of surrounded by these very big buildings. The public space is quite expansive, but doesn't have much of a relationship with the building around it. Also, quite simply, it wasn't as good a site. So the site in Vancouver was on the waterfront. The site in Toronto was near the waterfront, but there was an elevated expressway that sort of blocked the view to the waterfront. It was a sense of compromise site in that respect. And so hard to give it the same sense of place as had been achieved on the waterfront in Vancouver, which has been well documented that this was a critique of the site as it first started developing.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the severance and the isolation of the site, which I think does relate to what seemed like a bit of a rocky start in terms of the successive intents to develop the site. And it reminds me actually a great deal of Canary Wharf in that sense. So fits and starts, a lot of intent, a lot of recognized potential, and then also some serious design challenges in terms of severance. We've done work in Poplar, which is just north of Canary Wharf, but it's not just north of Canary Wharf, it's just north of Canary Wharf and then a motorway, and then, well, the DLR kind of goes through the bottom side of Poplar there. Can you talk a little bit about the ways that these master planned sites carry with them some sort of fundamental structural challenges?
Yeah, I think so. Always the vision dating right back to the 70s for the Cityplace site was to use this old railway marshalling yard, as it was, next to the Canadian National Railway, as the sort of joining piece between the waterfront and the rest of the city. I think the thing they struggled with most was there was a grade challenge. So from the railway corridor to the expressway, there's quite a significant downhill. The expressway or the motorway is elevated over the edge of the site as it tumbles down in that direction. So then by placing quite big buildings onto something that's rising up, the pedestrian experience is sort of compromised a bit. So the idea of the high density development was to actually enclose those challenges, to use urban form and high-rise urban form to almost make you forget that these are quite wide streets, very busy, elevated, crossing a railway. I don't think it was wholly successful at Cityplace. Cityplace, however, has been helped by the fact that the surrounding area has itself followed in terms of densification. Your example in Canary Wharf is similar. You know, although they are sort of physically close in number of yards or meters, that journey can feel really lengthy because you're navigating kind of loud, heavy infrastructure. And so it becomes an unpleasant pedestrian experience. That's improved a little bit because on the waterfront and also behind the railway corridor, similar densification has subsequently occurred. You know, it would still be better if there wasn't an elevated expressway and the railway corridor was quite so wide, of course. But all that helped to make things a little bit more urbane.
I want to draw another parallel to UK planning. In the book, you contextualize the case study of Cityplace in the context of land value capture and in the context of
here we go,
which we know a lot about here in the UK, and also in the context of austerity in the 90s in Toronto. Could you talk a bit about land value capture? What were the shortcomings of that approach in this case?
So there were two approaches to amenity provision or public benefit land value capture at Cityplace. The first was that, and I think this is really important actually for us to take a lesson from the UK to the UK, is that the site was owned by that railway company. And so CN Rail owned the site. There was a period of privatization of public assets, as was common in the sort of late 80s and 90s, and as the neoliberal era kind of took hold in Western economies. And so that land was put into the hands of a company called Canada Lands Corporation, which was a public company, to be prepared for sale when the railway was privatized. That's what happened. It was sold with a quite detailed levy regime attached to it, and also a subdivision plan and a secondary plan that established the build out and master plan of the site. So essentially what that meant was the original zoning for the site had a levy for each unit that would pay for things like the park, other public infrastructure that was going to be built. The park itself is on a City of Toronto piece of land that was kept, and so too is the building that has social housing in it. And so the levy paid for some of that infrastructure. So that ultimately included two primary schools, a Catholic and a non-denominational school that are connected in the same building along with a community centre. It made some, but not much, contribution to the social housing. And also it made a significant contribution to the public park that's called Canoe Landing. So that was the levy regime, right? However, there's a however, and this is also interesting. I think this is more like Section 106, okay? If the developer wanted to develop each of the plots of land that they had purchased beyond the zoning envelope that had been established in the plan, they had to pay additional money, negotiated with the city through something called Section 37 of the Ontario Planning Act. And that was where something much more similar to Section 106 is taking place. There's a baseline levy, but then if they wanted to make the buildings 50 stories high instead of 30 stories high, there was a negotiation for public amenities that would then be spent in the wider ward or constituency within which Cityplace is located.
Do you think the planners were able to secure a good deal out of that? I mean, overall?
No, I don't. Not really. And I think the reason for that had to do with them sort of dropping the ball on the negotiation at a time when the whole city is going through this massive densification. So we can't isolate Cityplace and think of it as just one site happening. Around it, the whole city is changing, and a huge number of applications for residential buildings are going in. I think the city could have probably leveraged more from this site than they ultimately managed. To give you a sense of that, the original master plan, this was before Concord bought the site, they talked in the plan about it looking sort of having a Parisian feel, 4 to 5 stories, bit of mixed use. And the idea was that 1,000 of those units would be social housing. So you'd end up with 4,000 units, 3,000 approximately were going to be for market sale, and that would help fund 1,000 affordable houses. There'd also be money coming in from the Canadian federal government for that housing as well. Fast forward to 2025, there's just shy of 14,000 private condominium units. A condominium is a private flat in simple terms, and there are 425 affordable houses total. I think that gives you a really good sense of how much the developer has managed to leverage on the site and deliver an awful lot of private units, and what the city's been able to achieve. I think it's also important to note that they also took a long time to build some of the other things that in theory were being paid for by the levy and the other negotiated public benefits. So the school didn't arrive until some people had been living there for a decade, which obviously makes community building more difficult. The school was only finished around 2020, 2021. A library was finished around a similar time, but there's still, to this day, a space behind the library that's supposed to be another park. Nothing's happened. And there's also a site where the city were going to build an additional social housing building. And when I was there in June, it's still a vacant site. Yet all the private condominiums are built, and they're much, much bigger than was ever originally envisaged. So I don't blame the developer necessarily for this. I would have liked them to have done things a little bit better, but I think the city could have taken a stronger negotiating stance. And I think the developer would have still walked away with a handsome profit, but the city would have got a lot more for its wider public than it ultimately managed to capture through the land value capture mechanism that they used.
I think that this touches on something that affects our work. And if listeners of the pod want to go back and listen to episode 10, can affect the sense of purpose and contribution of professionals in our field. It's this distance between what is and what should be. How you put it makes a lot of sense and has a lot of resonance. I don't blame the developer necessarily, but I would have liked them to have contributed more. It goes, Alex, to your point as well. The question is, did the planners effectively get a good deal? So I want to kind of throw a framework around a little bit and offer a starting point that companies are morally neutral, right? A private company, it exists to optimize a return on investment. Mm-hmm. LPAs want more affordable housing. Councillors want more affordable housing. And I understand that frustration and I share it. But also I think that sometimes that frustration is misdirected. So the framework that I really want to offer is perhaps a suggestion that in cases where the developer has behaved like a private company, has pushed the envelope, has exploited opportunities, it's like blaming a wild animal for being a wild animal. Going back to the first episode actually of the podcast, this is fundamentally a regulatory system. And it's like, if the regulator doesn't like the outcome, whose fault is that? Change the rules, bro, right?
I think that's broadly how I see it too. It's ultimately a political problem, not an easy political problem to solve. Yeah. But, if governments are elected by the people and the people ultimately collectively choose right-leaning government with more neoliberal philosophy, keen to see more privatization, less government spending, et cetera, then the regulations are going to kind of follow that political desire. There's also, to your point, just the sheer complexity of being a planner that we can't divorce ourselves from, because in a way, planning has this sort of unenviable position between the public and the private sector.
Yeah.
It's less pure than the architectural profession, which has a very defined focus on design that sort of defines what it's about, and it can stand behind that position.
Must be nice, right?
Well, indeed. There's lots of challenges for architects around fee levels and how their work is valued, which is another conversation. But it's a simpler sense of what they are. And similarly for chartered surveyors, they are there to exist to support the real estate industry, which has a, in a capitalist system, has a profit motive.
Yeah.
But for planners, they're operating betwixt and between the public and the private. Approximately, I think it's about 40% of chartered planners work in the private sector, like yourselves.
Hello.
Ultimately have to, balance their need to generate profit with the missions they may have as a company. But to the fundamental point, I think, is that we struggle as planners, and this is quite well documented in research, to define the public interest intent of planning or the common good. And if we don't have a clear understanding of that, or what we want to achieve through the planning system, it makes it very difficult to have consistent rules and regulations that deliver some of those things that you're talking about, like genuinely affordable, decent housing and high quality public spaces that are accessible for all.
Yeah. Speaking from planning practice, I mean, we like to think that it all comes out in the viability wash, right? But as you say, it's a lot more complex than that. We have, I don't know if we want to call it a science of development viability, where we try to say, okay, we can capture this amount of value without halting delivery.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think that, well, certainly from the research on this book and other projects I've been involved in, I also get the sense that planners, especially in the public sector, are sometimes reticent to challenge the viability calculations that developers have made. Sometimes because...
Not in London.
So it's in a sort of philosophical level, a lot of planners, even if they're working in the public sector, want to see development happen, right? And the way to see development happen is to reach a successful negotiation that gets something built, right? Now, those on the more radical part of the spectrum might not see that as the goal of planning. They may see it as ensuring that if development is to take place, then the public interest must be protected. Whether planners in the public sector, do they even have the skills to understand and engage with the viability calculations that have been made about particular sites? And do they have any agency to propose an alternative? So all these things are happening. So if you're a planner, you've got to process the planning application for a standardized housing extension on a piece of greenfield land. The developers told you that it's only viable to build these standardized boxes with the most basic materials. They haven't got any money for a play park. There's no way we can do anything better. Do you let that through because you need to meet your housing targets that your political masters on council have set? Do you push back, which may cost the council more money in delays or an appeal that you may not win? How do you make the decision to push for better quality if all these other things are happening too? So is the site viable or not? Don't know. Might be, might not be. It might also be that the developer knows it's perfectly viable to do these things, but they'll make less profit and therefore that wouldn't be great for them. Then you'll get other developers that are prepared to meet you in the middle somewhere. And we shouldn't lose sight that those developers are there and actually can produce some really good places in collaboration with planners. I suspect those are the types of projects that planning consultants and local authority planners most enjoy working on, but they're not always the ones that make the most money.
We'll be right back.
The best projects are always, always, always the projects where there is an active conversation. On viability, my personal view and my professional view, frankly, is that it should not be a part of the planning balance, full stop. It should be publicly funded correctly, so the proportion is hit, and it takes the emotional frustration, which again I think is often misdirected, out of the planning equation. So we actually can focus on the placemaking, design, whatever it is. I think that there's always a benefit to cases where an LPA has a third-party reviewer of the viability, because that solves the expertise issue. What it doesn't solve is the agency issue, because the way that planning and viability interact at the moment, even when that third-party reviewer says on-site affordable housing delivery isn't viable here, there's still that disconnect between is and should. And there's that resentment. It's like, yeah, but they're profiting from this. And it's like, well, yeah, they're also building it. And people are so pissed about it. They're pissed at me. You know what I mean? What does keep coming back to mind is the absence of public money in development and planning. For Cityplace, you've got the neoliberalization of funding structures. Does it look like the developer really pushed the envelope here? Yeah.
You're right that this is actually a theme through the book. I know I started at the beginning of our conversation talking about the kind of design journey of the project, but ultimately the book ends thinking more about the impacts of vertical urbanization on city form and the public good. And we developed an idea in the book, which I call planning by concession, which essentially, John and I, trying to argue that the way in which planning works slowly, incrementally, and cumulatively chips away at the public interest. So it's planning by concession because we're constantly letting capital go a little bit further than the boundaries that we've set to get an outcome. But we do this cumulatively. We don't do it in one big fail swoop, typically. It's done in small little decisions between different actors in the system. I see it a bit like a Faustian bargain. All right, we'll give you more, but you give us this. But we kind of know that what we're getting back isn't as good as what we're giving. To your point then, so how do we solve this? And I think you're right, but it's going to be difficult, is one around a stronger role if politics and the public want it in the delivery of these things. Our system is set up in the UK to be discretionary, which means flexibility is at its heart. And I think that's one of our problems. Unlike many other countries around the world that use zoning has its many problems of its own, but it at least allows a local planning authority to establish clearer ground rules about what is acceptable on particular sites and over time. And the mode of our system, which allows developers to speculate on sites in a much more open manner, just means that there has to be more negotiation with the public sector about what's appropriate. Whereas if the public sector had stronger teeth and was able to establish those rules, it could have at least a modicum of control over the place at which the conversation starts. So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And then sure, we probably should have more public money for social housing. How do we do that? Well, either through general taxation or adopting higher development charges. So if you look at the development charges in the city of Toronto, they're done unit by unit. I don't have the book to hand, it's behind me on the shelf. But I think the development charge for a one-bedroom unit at Cityplace was somewhere in the region of $30,000. So for a high-rise tower with 200 units, you're looking at a planning application fee essentially in the millions, as well as the levy and as well as any negotiation for subsequent height. So you've kind of got a development charge that's not just a processing fee, but an actual fee that pays for quite a lot of infrastructure as well. So there are all these things to think about. And then, or we can look to other countries, do a bit of policy mobility ourselves, right? And look to countries like the Netherlands, where, you know, I was there in the summer on holiday with the family and we were cycling through what are essentially standardized housing estates, yet they feel like the best designed place you visited in years.
Yeah.
So they're proving it can be done. You can deliver standardized housing estate, high design quality, excellent public amenities, walkable, sustainable, all the things that you need. It can be done in a market-based system, and the Dutch can do it. But the public sector in Holland and in the wider Netherlands does have a stronger role to play in land assembly and the preparation of land than we like to do. We have a tendency here, I think, to not want to do that, to let the market make those choices. And I think that's a big challenge for us.
I completely agree that there is a political economy question and there's a political consciousness question, perhaps, which is exactly why I can't go to an officer and say, well, I get that you're mad, but don't be mad at me, right, to your MP, right? That would sound unbelievably glib, but I have a podcast, so here we are. The other thing that I wanted to turn to is housing supply and verticality as a potential solution with downsides relative to the housing needs that global cities face at the moment. is up kind of the only option, or is it medium density, urban extension? Where's the sweet spot in that balance?
Yeah, I think it's this difficult question.
Thank you.
I think there's a tendency to swing to the extremes. In Toronto and also in London, my sense is that in these global cities, we either build on the edge, low density, or we build towers. And we're not particularly good at doing the mid-rise stuff in between.
Yeah.
Why? Well, I think it's more complicated. It's easy to buy a field and put some boxes up. And we've got some big FTSE 100 listed companies that are very good at doing that. They don't produce high quality environments for all the reasons we've discussed, but they can build at volume as and when they want to. The high-rise developers that operate in London are almost an entirely different beast. They know how to do a high-rise tower. They're often funded by global capital. They sometimes are actually just international companies like
Lend-Lease, for example.
Lend-Lease is a good example. Yeah. The
Lend-Lease give us work, by the way. Thanks.
So they're doing almost an entirely different project that's not going to land in Manchester or Bradford or Glasgow in quite the same way.
Yeah.
Finding the developers to do the mid-rise stuff that we think is probably better urban design is therefore tricky. And the land is there. It just needs to be carefully assembled. We need to think about how things are torn down or redeveloped, thinking long-term about neighborhood strategies of places that are going to experience density. I don't think just keeping building low density on the edge and high-rise towers in the middle is the solution to the housing crisis at all.
I could not agree more. I'm okay with the towers, and I appreciate that there are aesthetic challenges and there's sort of a community building challenge that exists with those. I'm not too sure that it's that independent from the community building challenge that exists in more medium density places.
No, and let's remember that people live in high-rise apartments all over the world.
All over the world.
Quite happily, and enjoy it and like the closeness to the city. Our experience in the UK with high-rise has tended to be modernist housing from the mid-20th century that was largely social. However, also some of those buildings were much loved places to live. Not all of them, but some of them were, and some people didn't want to move out of them. So a tower itself isn't necessarily bad. In a way, it's how it hits the ground and what the experience of it is around it.
I think that there could be a sort of cultural trauma point there, because we were on a public consultation and it was during COVID, so it was all online, and somebody logged into the Teams call as "fuck tower blocks" was their username. And it's like, all right, yeah, but also that building was, I think, 12 stories, something like that. So they were making a point, but it wasn't exactly about what our client was proposing. It was about an emotional reaction to what taller buildings meant in the post-war era. So setting the towers aside, right? I want to talk about these sort of brick cubes that are all arranged in greenfield development and urban extensions. My sense, talking to surveyors, is that there's a nervousness in the industry to deviate from what they know works because they have market data to demonstrate that these units will sell. How do we solve that low density urban extension development?
Well, so those developers that you describe are big and very well off in many respects. You're right, they have a particular way they like to do stuff. They're risk averse, they're small c conservative. They're also part of the blockage on the need to deliver lots of homes. They're the ones that are holding sites back, making sure the market's right, deciding when to bring it forward. They tend to be slowing things down just as much, if not more, than the planning system, which is often blamed.
As it should be. It's both. It's both, maybe. But yeah.
So this comes back to the point we were discussing a few minutes ago, which is around what does the local authority do? So if the local authority had more money, if the local authority had more power, if the local authority was actually given support by central government instead of being told that it's a blockage on growth, perhaps it would be able to work with developers better to force them to create better places. Right now, that dynamic doesn't really exist. And also, to be fair to public planners, I think we need to stress this. The local authority development management planners often put an awful lot of effort into making very bad standardized housing schemes slightly better, and they should be applauded for that. The other thing, I guess, is just to quickly mention that I think there is a market there for the type of better quality medium to low rise development that you're talking about. I just don't think that those developers have any interest in trying to find that market. They know they've got a market for the product they produce to make a handsome profit. So they see no need to change what they're doing to create something different. And I think that's going to require new entrants into the market, so SMEs and others that can offer a different product on a different type of site to a different type of consumer. It could happen. I think they'd probably be successful. They could make it work. But the industry is so dominated by the big public listed companies that it's very hard for them to make a competitive bid for the type of land that they want to develop. So perhaps we need to think as a public sector, or in a public sense, are there mechanisms, taps and otherwise, to make the entry for those SMEs easier?
Yeah, and if the planners in the public sector were freed to look at those more strategic design choices rather than, as you say, the amount of energy, which can be an immense amount of energy, put into making a low density typology slightly better, it would be really helpful for that energy to be put towards something that's more transformational than incremental in design terms. Personally, I'm a big fan of the if you build it, they will come. You know, these are successful. They don't feel like city centers. I live in a city center and I like it. And I know that that's not for everybody, but they're much more like the 20th century streetcar suburb, which is almost everywhere going to be one of the most expensive parts of a metropolitan area, because they are nice places at appropriate density.
I had a similar thought, actually. How do we improve the process to make sure that we free up planners essentially to focus on where they need to focus their efforts, right? And I want to respond, James, to the two kind of lessons you mentioned earlier, one about land assembly, the other about zoning. And, you know, when we mention zoning in the UK, people always freak out and say, oh my gosh, that would be so different to what we have now. And that, you know, that's what the Americans do. But actually, like if you start looking at even in a zonal system, like, you know, in the case you studied in your book, that starts to look a whole lot like what we have here in the UK. For those bigger type of developments, which really we should, as planners, be focusing on those key developments that are really going to shape places and the city. If we optimize the process a little bit, can we free up resources to kind of really focus on where they're needed most?
So that's quite a radical proposition, right? In the context of the, I sometimes make a very similar argument, right? So the Cityplace example, you're quite right. There was like an as of right zoning envelope, but the city allowed a quasi discretionary process to take place. John Punter, in an earlier book about this type of thing, called it like discretionary zoning. So there is a zoning plan. It set the parameters. If you look at the original plan, the same blocks were developed, the public spaces in the same place, the street-facing units do indeed face the street. A lot of the things in the zoning was achieved, but their envelope for development got much higher and bulkier as a result of discretion. Should that happen? That's the political debate. You can choose to be, as a local authority, stronger or not so strong on what negotiation you allowed to occur. The more radical point is, well, yeah, if we just allowed small planning applications to not go through a detailed discretionary process. I want to change the use of this shop. I just need to change this sign. I want to build a slightly bigger extension on my house. If that's all in a zoning envelope and everyone knows what the rule is, potentially it could work. I think in the UK, where there is an expectation of public engagement in each and every planning decision, in each and every local street and neighborhood, that would be a very hard sell. I think we have this innate nostalgia for a design aesthetic of the British Isles that will be very hard to make that type of thing work.
A regimented typology, I think, is still achievable. I think it actually kind of speaks to a point that, like, core urban design principles aren't that complicated, right? Like, we spend a lot of time being very nervous about this complexity, but you can get 80 to 90% of it right off the bat.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And I don't really know why we don't do more site-based master planning. That's really what we should be doing.
Yeah.
I think that's quite right.
This has been fantastic. Like, really, really, just frankly, a lot of fun.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation. I think it all comes down to What kind of planning system do we really want, and what do we want it to do, and how do we make some of these radical changes happen? And there's not easy answers to any of these questions. I think if it was for me, the thing to do is to really continue to strengthen the climate change almost mission of planning, and not to lose sight of it, that actually planning has so much to play in delivering net zero places, despite all of these forces of capital and growth politics and the like. If planning can be the kind of cheerleader for creating more sustainable places through the decisions it makes, I think that's the route to a better future and a better planning system. At present, there's a yawning gap between the aspirations for climate and place and what we ultimately approve through the planning process. That's the conundrum, I think, that needs to be solved. And obviously, density is one of the routes to that.
I think that I want to go one meta layer above that, because climate is an important issue, and it also fits alongside housing supply. It also fits alongside transit-oriented development. If planning could be more proactive and less reactive, we've tried the local plan-led system. It doesn't really achieve the outcomes that we're talking about in terms of global and societal externalities. We need to be proactive. You know, the state has assumed the exclusive right to develop. It also needs to decide what it wants to do with that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And participate actively in that. Yeah.
Yeah, quite right.
James, thank you again so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. That was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host, Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.